The day Claire Voss walked into Hargrove Memorial Hospital, the head of trauma surgery looked at her resume, set it down on the counter, and laughed. Not a small laugh. A full, open-mouthed laugh. The kind that fills a room and tells everyone else it's safe to join in. And they did. Every resident, every attending, every nurse who wanted to stay on his good side. They all laughed at the quiet woman standing in the doorway with secondhand scrubs and no prestigious hospital on her record. None of them knew she had once carried a dying soldier through a minefield. None of them knew what was coming. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now. And subscribe so you never miss what happens next. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The offer letter had come through a staffing agency, which was the first thing that bothered Dr. Marcus Holt. Not the woman herself. He hadn't met her yet. Just the process. Hargrove Memorial in Salt Lake City was one of the top-ranked trauma centers in the Mountain West, and the idea that someone could walk through its doors via a third-party placement firm without going through the hospital's own vetting pipeline rubbed him the wrong way. He'd said as much to the nursing director, Pamela Reyes, and Pamela had nodded along and then gone ahead and approved the hire anyway because they were 2 nurses short in the trauma bay and the schedule was already collapsing. So when Claire Voss arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, the introductions were already loaded. She was 34, medium height, dark hair pulled back tight. She had a kind of stillness to her that some people read as calm, and others read as blankness. She carried a small bag. She wore her scrubs like they were whatever. Not a costume, not a statement, just clothes. She shook Pamela's hand and thanked her and said she was glad to be there. And she meant it. And none of that landed well on a floor where people measured confidence by how loud you talked. Marcus saw her in the hallway outside triage at 7:18 a.m. and made his assessment in about 4 seconds. "This her?" he said to his resident, Derek Faulds, without lowering his voice. Derek glanced over. "Yeah, Claire Voss, transfer from, I don't know, somewhere in Idaho. No major hospital on her sheet. Community clinic, I think." Marcus looked at the paperwork Derek had already pulled up on the tablet. He scrolled once, twice. His expression didn't change, but something in it settled. The look of a man who has confirmed what he already believed. "Community clinic," he repeated. He handed the tablet back and walked toward the admit desk, and as he passed Claire, he gave her a quick, flat look. Not hostile, just dismissive. The kind of glance you'd give a piece of furniture that's been moved to the wrong room. Claire noticed. She'd been noticed that way before. She took a breath through her nose and turned back to the orientation packet Pamela had given her. The thing about Hargrove was that it had a culture. Most hospitals do. But Hargrove's was particularly sharp because Marcus Holt had spent 11 years building it around himself. He was talented. That was real. He had hands that could work a trauma bay with genuine precision, and his instincts under pressure were good. And he knew it the way people who are genuinely skilled sometimes know it in a way that curdles. The knowing becomes the whole personality. The skill becomes armor and then weapon. He'd trained 3 of the other attendings. 2 of the senior residents had specifically applied to Hargrove to work under him. The nursing staff, with a few exceptions, had learned that agreeing with Marcus Holt made your shift easier and disagreeing made it very long. Claire learned this on day 3. She was covering a morning shift in triage when a 15-year-old boy came in presenting with what the intake nurse had logged as a migraine, severe headache, photosensitivity, neck stiffness. His mother was doing that particular kind of controlled panic that parents do when they don't want to frighten their child, but are already frightened themselves. Claire sat with the boy for 4 minutes, asked him 3 questions the intake form hadn't covered, then she stepped out and found Derek Faulds. "That kid in Bay 4, she said. "I think we need to rule out bacterial meningitis before we push him off to neurology." Derek looked at her. He was 28 and sharp and still at the stage of his residency where he was learning who to listen to and who to manage. "Marcus already flagged him as migraine presentation," Derek said. "I know, but he has neck rigidity and the fever spiked in the last 20 minutes. The mother said he complained about a rash on his leg last night that's already fading." Derek's expression shifted. Just slightly. Something crossed it that wasn't dismissal. But then Marcus appeared at the end of the corridor, and Derek straightened. "Problem?" Marcus said, walking toward them. "No," Derek said. Nurse Voss had a question about the kid in Bay 4. Marcus looked at Claire. Migraine presentation. Neurology consult is in. He has neck stiffness, Claire said, and a history of a petechial rash last night. Did you go to medical school, Nurse Voss? She held the pause one beat. I'm flagging a symptom cluster. And I heard you. His voice was pleasant. That was the thing about Marcus. He wasn't a screamer. He was worse than that. He was patient in a way that felt like contempt. When I want a second opinion, I'll ask another doctor. Thanks. He walked away. Claire stood there. Derek looked at the floor. She went back to Bay 4 and checked the boy's temperature again. It had gone up another degree in 12 minutes. She pulled the attending on duty, not Marcus, a hospitalist named Dr. Angie Wu, who covered overflow, and laid it out plainly. Angie Wu ordered the spinal tap. The result came back 2 hours later. Bacterial meningitis. They caught it before it turned fatal. When the mother found out, she cried in the hallway and grabbed Claire's hand and wouldn't let go for a long time. Claire squeezed back and told her the boy would be okay, and then went to refill her water bottle because she was behind on everything else, and the shift wasn't over. Marcus never mentioned it. But the next morning, Claire's schedule had been adjusted. She'd been moved off triage and assigned to overnight floor coverage on the surgical wing. It wasn't punitive on paper. On paper, it was a staffing need. Everyone knew what it was. She told herself it didn't matter. She'd made that promise when she left the army, that the small indignities of civilian life weren't worth the energy, that she was done spending herself on people who didn't deserve the fight. She had good reasons to be here, real reasons. Her sister lived in Salt Lake. Her nephew was 7 and learning to read and sometimes called her on Tuesday nights to tell her about dinosaurs. She wanted a life that fit inside normal walls. She wanted to sleep in a bed that was hers and cook dinner and not flinch at car backfires. She had not entirely achieved that last one, but she was working on it. She did the overnight shifts. She did the floor coverage. She answered call lights and changed dressings and charted everything exactly right and kept her mouth shut unless a patient needed her not to. She was not invisible. You couldn't be entirely invisible, not when you were good at your job, and she was genuinely good, but she kept the profile low. And then Marcus did the thing in the medication room. She'd been changing out an IV line in the early afternoon when she heard him in the hallway talking to 2 of his residents, Falds, and a second year named Tobias Marsh. She wasn't trying to listen. The door was open. You know what her problem is, Marcus was saying, and his voice had that particular quality it got when he was performing for an audience. Teaching, he would have called it. She walked in here thinking that watching enough medical videos or working a rural clinic for 3 years qualifies her to second-guess attending physicians. It doesn't. That's not humility. That's not instinct. That's someone who doesn't know what they don't know. Tobias Marsh laughed a little too quickly. She almost got into it with you on the meningitis kid, Derek said. Almost, Marcus said. And thank God for that, because if she'd actually pushed that, I would have had to have a real conversation with Pamela about whether this hire was a mistake. You want nurses who support the clinical process, not nurses who think they're the clinical process. Claire finished with the IV line. She smoothed the tape at the edges. She checked the flow rate. She walked back to her patient's room and closed the door quietly behind her. A week passed, then 2. She learned the rhythms of Hargrove the way she'd learned every assignment, by watching before moving, mapping the terrain before committing to a path. She understood which residents would hear her and which wouldn't. She knew which attendings treated her like staff and which ones treated her like furniture. She knew that the charge nurse on day shift, a woman named Rosario Gutierrez, was the person who actually kept the floor functional, and that Rosario had been doing it for 16 years without Marcus Holt noticing once. She and Rosario started eating lunch at the same time most days, not by arrangement, just by convergence. He moved you to nights, Rosario said one afternoon without looking up from her salad. Staffing need, Claire said. Rosario made a sound that was not agreement. He did the same thing to a travel nurse 18 months ago. Guy caught a post-op bleed that Marcus missed on rounds. Marcus had him reassigned to the recovery ward by Friday. The guy left after his contract ended. She speared a piece of cucumber. Didn't renew. I'm not going anywhere, Claire said. Rosario looked at her then, just for a second. No, Rosario said. I don't think you are. The patient in room 14 was named Gerald Okafor, and he was 61 years old, and he was dying in the specific way that hospitals sometimes allowed people to die. Not all at once, not dramatically, but through a series of small failures that added up. He'd come in for a hip replacement. Routine, he was otherwise healthy, but on day 2 post-op he'd developed what the surgical team had charted as mild respiratory distress and attributed to anesthesia after effects. And by day 4 the respiratory distress was not mild, but the chart still said mild because no one had updated it. And on day 5 Claire was doing her floor rounds, and she stopped outside his room because something about the way he was breathing had caught her attention. The way sounds sometimes caught her attention in ways she couldn't always explain. She went in. Gerald was awake. He looked tired in the way that was different from ordinary tired. The way that meant the body was spending itself on something it shouldn't have to spend itself on. "How are you breathing?" she asked. "Fine," he said, which was what people said. Scale of 1 to 10, how much effort does it take right now to pull in a breath? He thought about it. 6, maybe? Has it been like that all day? Since this morning, maybe last night. She listened to his lungs. The left lower lobe had almost no air movement. She checked his leg. The calf of his right leg was swollen and tender when she pressed it gently, and Gerald winced and said it had been like that for 2 days, but he'd figured it was from the surgery. She stepped into the hallway and found the resident covering the surgical floor. "Gerald Okafor in 14. I need a D-dimer and a CT pulmonary angiography. I think he's throwing a clot." The resident, a third-year named Sophie Anand, was already nodding before Claire finished the sentence. Sophie was one of the good ones. She ordered the tests. Marcus happened to be on the floor 20 minutes later for a post-op check on a different patient. He saw the imaging order in the system and found Sophie. "Why are we doing a CTPA on the Okafor patient?" Sophie straightened. "Nurse Voss flagged reduced breath sounds and unilateral leg swelling. I agreed with her assessment." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Not an angry quiet, something more like controlled. "Where is she?" he said. Claire was at the nursing station. He walked up to her directly, which was unusual. He usually conducted these conversations sideways, in corridors, through intermediaries. "Mr. Okafor," he said, "you ordered imaging." "I flagged symptoms to Dr. Anand, and she ordered imaging. You're covering floor nursing, not conducting diagnostic workups." "I reported what I observed." She held his gaze. Her voice was level. Not aggressive, not performatively calm, just level. "If I'm wrong, the CT will show it. And when you're wrong, we've spent time and resources and probably scared the patient. And if I'm right," she said, "we caught a pulmonary embolism before it killed him." The CT showed a massive bilateral pulmonary embolism. Gerald Okafor was moved to the ICU within the hour. The hematology team said another 12 hours without intervention, and the outcome would have been different. Different was the word they used. They meant dead. Marcus read the report. He didn't say anything to Claire, not then, but the next day her schedule had been adjusted again. She was now on overnight rotations exclusively, which meant she'd effectively been removed from the floor during the hours when decisions got made and learning happened and people got noticed. And this time it wasn't subtle. Rosario found her in the break room at the end of Claire's first overnight shift, which ended at 7 in the morning, and Rosario set a coffee cup in front of her and sat down. "He put in a note to Pamela," Rosario said. "I saw it. It's not a formal complaint. He called it a culture fit concern. Said you have difficulty deferring to the clinical hierarchy." Claire wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. It was warm. "What does Pamela think?" "Pamela thinks keeping Marcus happy is part of her job, and she's not entirely wrong about that." Rosario paused. "I'm telling you because you should know, not because I think you should do anything, or not do anything. I think you should know." "I appreciate it," Claire said. Rosario looked at her for a moment. "You're not scared of him?" It wasn't a question. "No," Claire said. "Why not?" Claire drank her coffee. Outside the break room window, the sun was just coming up over the Wasatch Mountains, painting the snow on the peaks in orange and gold. "I've met scarier," she said. The call came in on a Thursday night at 11:47 p.m. Claire was on her third overnight shift, managing 2 post-surgical patients and a sepsis case in the ICU step-down unit when the emergency alert came through the hospital intercom system. Not a standard trauma activation, but a mass casualty alert, which was different and which triggered a different part of Claire's nervous system. The report came in fragments over the next 4 minutes. A propane storage facility on the outskirts of Salt Lake City had experienced a series of explosions. The first responders on scene were reporting multiple casualties. Burn injuries, blast trauma, crush injuries from a secondary structural collapse. At least 30 people, possibly more. Hargrove Memorial was the closest Level 1 trauma center. They were coming here. The overhead lights in the trauma bay shifted to the emergency configuration, brighter, colder, the shadows flattened out. And the on-call teams began moving, and Marcus Holt appeared at the entrance to the trauma bay in a shirt that meant he'd been called from home, still buttoning his cuff. He stood at the center of the bay, and Claire watched him from the doorway of the step-down unit, and she could see the moment. She knew this moment very well. When a person who was used to controlled situations understood that the situation was not controlled and might not be. The first ambulance arrived at 11:53. The second at 11:55. By midnight, there were 4 and then 6. And then the bay doors were open, and there were people on gurneys in the corridor and 2 people who'd arrived by private vehicle who had walked in on their own and then sat down on the floor because they couldn't stand anymore. And the noise level was a particular kind of noise that Claire recognized the way you recognized a song you hadn't heard in years, immediately in your body before your mind caught up. She stepped into the trauma bay. She was not supposed to be there. She was floor nursing, overnight. The trauma bay in a mass casualty event was attending territory and senior resident territory, and she had no standing there, no formal role, and she knew Marcus Holt was 10 feet away. She stepped in anyway. The first patient she reached was a man in his 40s, with burns across 40% of his upper body and a pattern of blast injuries that told her, before she'd touched him, that he also had internal trauma. His pressure was tanking. The resident at his bedside was a first year who was doing her best, and her best right now was not going to be enough. "What's his pressure?" Claire said. 80/50 and dropping. "What's your fluid volume?" "We pushed a liter." "Push another, and get me a fast exam now. His abdomen is rigid." She was already at the bedside, already gloved. "What's his airway?" "Compromised. Blast. I see it. Get respiratory in here." She did not raise her voice. She had learned a long time ago that raising your voice in this kind of environment cost you something you needed to conserve. You spoke clearly and at a pitch that cut through, and you kept your tone flat, because flat was the tone that stopped other people's panic. The resident looked at her for exactly 1 second of assessment, and then started moving. From across the bay, Marcus Holt turned and saw Claire Voss at the bedside of his patient in his trauma bay, with her hands in motion and her voice giving instructions his resident was following. He started to move toward her. And then the second wave arrived. 2 more gurneys through the bay doors simultaneously, 2 paramedics calling out vitals at volume, a 3rd crash cart alarm going off somewhere to the left, and the entire bay shifted into a frequency that Marcus Holt had trained for and prepared for and genuinely believed he was ready for, and he turned back toward it, and the moment passed. Claire didn't look at him. She was already moving to the next patient. The second wave hit the trauma bay like a tide that hadn't peaked yet. Gurneys came through the doors with paramedics shouting vitals in overlapping voices, and the organized system that Hargrove's trauma team had trained for began to show its seams within the first 8 minutes. The bay had been designed for 2, maybe 3 simultaneous critical cases. Tonight it was absorbing 6, with more incoming. Claire moved to a woman in her late 50s who had been pulled from the secondary collapse, a storage structure adjacent to the main propane facility that had gone down when the pressure wave hit the support columns. The woman's left arm was pinned under debris for an estimated 11 minutes before extraction, which meant crush syndrome was already in motion. Her potassium was going to be dangerous. Her kidneys would be fighting. The resident assigned to her was Tobias Marsh. and Tobias Marsh was frozen in the specific way that people froze when they had learned medicine from textbooks and simulations, and the real version turned out to be louder and bloodier and more chaotic than either. "Tobias," Claire said. He looked at her. There was something like relief in it. "Crush injury, 11-minute entrapment. We need aggressive IV fluids, normal saline, wide open, now. Get a Foley in, we need to watch her urine output closely. And get a stat potassium. If she's hyperkalemic, we need to know before her heart decides to tell us." "Right," he said. "Right." He was moving again. Claire stayed with the patient long enough to confirm the fluid line was running correctly, and then crossed to the far side of the bay where a man in his 30s was in the process of coding. The crash cart was there. A respiratory tech was there. The first-year resident who'd been managing the blast injury patient, her name tag said Flores, was doing compressions with the focused, slightly blank expression of someone running on training and adrenaline. "How long?" Claire said. 3 minutes. V-fib, we shocked once. Epinephrine? In. Shock him again. Flores looked up, just for a second, not challenging, just the automatic hesitation of a junior resident being directed by a nurse in a situation where the hierarchy was unclear. "His rhythm's still shockable," Claire said. "Shock him." Flores nodded to the tech. They cleared and shocked, and the man's body arched and settled, and the monitor held for 2 seconds, and then showed sinus rhythm, broken and irregular, but rhythm, and Flores let out a breath she'd probably been holding since the second ambulance arrived. "Good," Claire said, and she meant it, and then she was moving again. It was during the third traverse across the bay. She was heading toward a teenage boy with blast injuries to both legs, whose pressure was inconsistent in a way that meant she needed to physically be at his side, that she felt the grip on her upper arm. Not hard, but deliberate. "Marcus Holt." "A word, what?" he said. She stopped, pulled her arm free without making it a scene, looked at him. His face was doing several things at once, the professional control on the surface, and underneath it something that might have been anger, or might have been the specific discomfort of a man who was very good at his job watching someone else be equally good at it in front of his staff. "You're floor nursing," he said, low and precise. "You have no role here. I have 2 critical patients on step down who are currently stable and being covered by Rosario. I have training in mass casualty response. You are 3 attendings short, and your first years are in over their heads. That's not your call to make." "No," she agreed. "It's yours. So make it." Something moved across his face that she didn't have time to read. "If you compromise any outcome in this bay tonight, I will have you removed from this hospital permanently." "Understood," she said, and turned back toward the teenager with the blast injuries. She heard him behind her, not following, not calling her back, just standing there. And then she heard him redirect toward the incoming gurney at the bay doors, which was what he should have been doing, and she stopped thinking about Marcus Holt and put everything she had into the boy in front of her. His name was Ryan, according to the medic who'd brought him in, 17, had been doing a summer internship at the facility's administrative offices when the first explosion hit. The blast had thrown him into a concrete pillar. Both legs showed obvious deformity, but that wasn't what worried Claire. What worried her was the asymmetry in his chest wall movement and the soft crackling she felt when she pressed along his left rib cage. Pneumothorax. Tension, possibly developing. She located Derek Faulds across the bay. He was the most senior resident on the floor tonight, and she needed a physician to make the call. "Derek?" She caught his eye. 17-year-old blast trauma. "I need you over here now. I think he's developing tension pneumo." Derek crossed to her in 12 seconds. He assessed, asked the boy to breathe deep, watched the chest wall, pressed where Claire indicated. His face changed. "Get me a 14-gauge needle," he said, and then to Claire. "Left second intercostal?" "Second intercostal, mid-clavicular," she confirmed. Derek needle decompressed the chest. The sound was unmistakable, a hiss of released pressure, and Ryan's oxygen saturation, which had been dropping, stabilized. The boy's face changed too. The particular gray quality that had been settling into his skin began, slowly, to reverse. "Good catch," Derek said. He wasn't looking at her when he said it. He was already calling for a chest tube setup. But he said it. Tease. The mass casualty event officially ran for 4 hours and 19 minutes from first arrival to last stabilized patient. By the time it was over, 23 patients had been admitted from the propane facility explosion. 2 had died. 1 on scene before arrival, 1 in the first hour who had arrived with injuries that were, in the attending's documentation, unsurvivable. The rest were alive, varying degrees of critical to stable, distributed across the ICU, surgical floors, and burn unit. Claire had been awake for 19 hours by the time she finished her documentation at 4:30 in the morning. She sat at the nursing station with a pen that had run out of ink halfway through, and she'd switched to a different one without noticing, and the 2 colors were visible across the form. She stared at it for a moment and decided it didn't matter. Rosario appeared beside her with a paper cup of coffee. Real coffee, from the machine in the physician's lounge that made the actual espresso shots, not the drip sludge from the break room. "Physician's lounge key?" Claire said. "Dr. Wu gave it to me 3 years ago and technically never asked for it back," Rosario said, sitting down. "Don't overthink it." They sat for a minute without talking. The trauma bay was quiet now, in the specific way it got after high-volume events. Not peaceful, just emptied out. The equipment was where it had been pushed to. A supply cart had a wheel that had been slightly bent during the chaos, and it listed to one side against the wall. "How many of those patients did you touch tonight?" Rosario asked. "I don't know, a lot." 8, Rosario said. "I counted. I was watching when I could." Claire drank her coffee. "Holt is going to come after you for this," Rosario said. It wasn't a warning so much as a statement of physical law, the way someone might say water was wet. "I know. He looked at you 3 times during the event. The 3rd time was, I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't the way he usually looks at people." "What did it look like?" Rosario considered. "Like he was trying to figure out what he was looking at." The formal complaint landed in Pamela Reyes's inbox at 8:47 in the morning, which meant Marcus had either written it before he slept or hadn't slept at all. Pamela called Claire in at 11. The office was small and had one window that looked out onto a parking structure and a framed motivational print about teamwork on the wall that Pamela had probably inherited from the previous nursing director and never quite gotten around to replacing. Pamela herself was a competent administrator in her late 40s who had long ago made peace with the fact that her job was mostly about managing tensions rather than resolving them. She set a printout on the desk between them. "Dr. Holt has filed a formal conduct report," Pamela said. "He's citing unauthorized clinical intervention during a mass casualty event, insubordination, and what he describes as a pattern of undermining physician authority." Claire read the document. It was thorough. Marcus Holt was many things, but not imprecise. "He's also requested," Pamela continued, "that you be suspended pending review, and that if you return to active duty, your role be restricted to non-clinical floor tasks." Claire set the document down. Non-clinical tasks. Vitals, transport, documentation support, no patient assessment, no clinical flagging. Claire looked at Pamela. Pamela looked at the window. 2 people who came in last night might not have made it if certain things hadn't happened when they happened, Claire said. A 17-year-old with a tension pneumothorax who is currently alive in the ICU. "I know," Pamela said quietly. "So what happens now?" Pamela pressed her fingers together. "The review committee meets in 3 days. Until then, Dr. Holt has requested you be reassigned to administrative support, which means you're off the floor." The word administrative sat in the room between them. "Pamela?" Claire said. "I'm sorry," Pamela said, and she looked it. That was the thing, she genuinely looked it. "My hands are not entirely free here." 3 days felt long in the specific way that waiting always felt long, when what you were waiting for was a decision someone else was making about your life. Claire filled the time with things that needed filling, She called her sister Donna, and they talked about her nephew's reading progress and a parent-teacher conference that had gone sideways, and a recipe Dana had tried from a cooking show that had turned out badly in a very specific way involving cardamom and overconfidence. It was the best conversation Claire had had in weeks. She didn't mention the review. Dana had enough going on. She ran because she always ran when she had too much thinking to burn off. Salt Lake City in November was cold in a way that was different from the cold she'd known in other places. It was dry and high altitude and clean in the lungs. And she ran along the Bonneville Shoreline Trail early in the mornings when there was nobody much around and the Wasatch Range was still dark against the lightening sky. She slept badly. She always slept badly. That part wasn't new. On the second day of her administrative suspension, she was in the hospital's small library. There was a library, barely used, mostly medical journals and reference texts. When Derek Fowles found her, he looked like he'd been working up to something. He sat down across from her without asking if she wanted company, which she took as a sign that whatever he had to say was more important to him than social comfort. "I testified to the review committee this morning," he said. She waited. "I told them what happened with the Okafor case, and with Ryan Callum, the kid with the pneumo." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. "I told them that in both cases your assessment was accurate and that waiting for a physician-directed evaluation would have cost time we didn't have." Claire looked at him. "Marcus knows you did that?" "He will." That was not a small thing for a resident to say, and they both understood it. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, genuinely working through the answer. "Because I almost didn't flag the Okafor order when Marcus questioned it. I almost let it go. And Gerald Okafor would have died in his bed, and it would have been in the chart as a post-surgical complication, and nobody would have been blamed for anything, and I would have had to live with knowing." He picked up a pencil from the table and turned it over. "I'm not going to do that a second time." Claire didn't say thank you. It felt like the wrong register. Instead, she said, "You're going to be a good doctor." He looked at her. "You're already a good nurse. Better than good." He set the pencil down. "What they're doing to you is wrong." "Yeah," she said. "I know." The review committee meeting was on a Friday afternoon, and Claire sat in a waiting room chair outside the conference room door and listened to the muffled sound of voices through the wall and thought about other rooms she'd waited outside, briefing rooms, command tents, the corridor outside a field hospital where they'd told her that the soldier she'd carried 2 kilometers through enemy territory with a tourniquet she'd fashioned from her own equipment was going to make it. That room had smelled like diesel and antiseptic and the specific metallic smell of a place that had seen too much blood. This room smelled like carpet cleaner and someone's lunch from a microwave. She wondered what the soldier was doing now. Corporal Danny Ruiz. He'd been 22. She'd heard later he'd gone to college on the GI Bill and was studying civil engineering somewhere in Texas. She'd never reached out. It had felt like a different lifetime, and maybe it was. The door opened at 4:17 p.m., and Pamela appeared. "They're ready for you." The committee was 5 people. 2 physicians Claire didn't recognize. External reviewers by the look of it. A hospital administrator named Douglas Firth, who had the tired eyes of a man who spent his days in meetings about other meetings. A patient advocacy representative. And Pamela. Marcus Holt was not in the room, which meant he'd given his testimony separately, which was standard procedure. They asked her questions for 40 minutes. She answered them directly and without elaboration unless elaboration was warranted. She did not apologize for any clinical decision. She explained each one in terms of the presenting symptoms, the time constraints, and the likely outcome of inaction, and she used precise medical language without ornamentation. And when they asked about her background and training, she said that she had clinical experience from multiple contexts and that she was happy to provide documentation. The documentation question was the one that had a different weight to it, and she felt it when the patient advocacy representative asked it. And she answered it the way she'd been answering it since she left the Army, carefully and without lying, but also without telling the whole truth, because the whole truth wasn't something she'd offered anyone at Hargrove. Not yet. The committee recessed to deliberate. It took 19 minutes. Pamela came out alone this time. "They're not suspending you," she said. Her voice was carefully neutral. "But they're upholding the restriction. Effective Monday, you're in a limited clinical role. You can perform nursing duties within a defined scope, but you cannot initiate clinical escalation without physician authorization." Claire stood in the waiting room with its carpet cleaner smell and its gray afternoon light coming through a narrow window. "What does that mean in practice?" she said. "In practice, it means you need to go through the attending before flagging anything diagnostic, even if you see something. Even if waiting costs the patient." Pamela met her eyes. "They're trying to find a middle path." "There isn't one," Claire said. "You either trust the person's clinical judgment or you don't." Pamela had no answer for that, and she didn't try to manufacture one, and Claire respected her more for it than she had before. She went back to work on Monday. The new restriction had a texture to it that was different from the overnight reassignments and the administrative suspension. Those had been blunt. This was precise, which meant it was designed to demoralize rather than simply punish, to make her feel the cage without removing her from the situation entirely. Marcus Holt was smart enough to know that firing her after the mass casualty event would raise questions. This was smarter. This was keeping her in place, visible, functioning just well enough to neutralize any argument, but limited in exactly the way that would make her feel the limitation every day. She understood the strategy. She didn't stop seeing what she saw. On Tuesday, she observed a patient in the step-down unit with a blood pressure pattern that made the back of her neck do the thing it did. She went to the attending on record, Dr. Raymond Chu, one of the hospitalists who was stretched across 14 patients and had the eyes of a man running on 3 hours of sleep, and she described what she'd seen, and he ordered the additional monitoring, and it turned out to be nothing, just an artifact of the patient's anxiety medication. That was fine. You had to be wrong sometimes. What mattered was the process. On Thursday, she flagged a medication error, a dosing discrepancy in a post-op patient's chart that was a factor of 10 mistake on an anticoagulant, and the system worked exactly as it was supposed to. She told the attending corrected the order, the patient never received the wrong dose. Small, procedural, no drama. Marcus saw the Thursday incident in the system and said nothing. But on Friday, he filed a supplementary note in the committee's ongoing review file, which Pamela forwarded to Claire as a courtesy, and which described Claire's persistent pattern of identifying issues outside her authorized scope in a way that made the medication error flagging sound like overreach rather than what it was. Claire read the note, sat with it, made a decision. She called her sister that night. "You sound tired," Dana said. "I am." "What's happening?" Claire thought about how to explain it to someone who wasn't in a hospital and hadn't been in the army and was living a regular life in a house with a 7-year-old who liked dinosaurs. "There's a situation at work," she said. "Someone's trying to make me small." Dana was quiet for a moment. "Is it working?" "No," Claire said, "but it's costing something." "What does it cost you not to fight back the way you want to?" Claire looked out her apartment window at the city. The mountains were invisible in the dark, but she knew where they were. "It costs the same thing, just slower." Dana made a sound, then, "You're not going to quit." "No." "Then figure out what you're waiting for and wait for it better." It wasn't elegant advice. It wasn't meant to be. But Dana knew her, and Claire sat with it, and it settled somewhere useful. What she was waiting for arrived on a Wednesday morning 17 days later in the form of an email that came through the hospital's general administrative system addressed to the chief medical officer and CC'd to the nursing director in the patient advocacy office, and puzzlingly, the hospital's external communications coordinator. Claire didn't see the email. She was on shift. She heard about it in pieces, the way news traveled through a hospital. Fragments, inference, the particular texture of people talking in lowered voices near supply closets. By mid-morning, she had enough pieces to assemble a picture. A man named Gerald Okafor, 61 years old, discharged from Hargrove Memorial 11 days ago, recovering at home in Mill Creek after a pulmonary embolism that had been caught and treated before it killed him, had written to the hospital. He'd written a long letter, apparently. carefully worded. He described in detail the circumstances of his admission and recovery and the specific moment when a nurse on the overnight floor rotation had entered his room and noticed something the surgical team had not and initiated a sequence of events that had kept him alive. He had included the nurse's name. He had included a request that the hospital review whether that nurse's subsequent reassignment was retaliatory in nature. And he had carbon copied the letter to the Salt Lake City Tribune's health desk. Rosario found Claire at the medication dispensing station at 11:23 a.m. with an expression that was doing its best to stay professionally neutral and not entirely succeeding. "You know about the Okafor letter," Claire said. "Everyone knows about the Okafor letter. Douglas Firth has been in Pamela's office for 40 minutes. Marcus Holt arrived at the hospital at..." She checked her watch. 40 minutes ago, so he came in specifically. He wasn't on until this afternoon. Claire finished drawing up the medication, checked the label against the order, checked it again. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Rosario said. "The Tribune called the External Communications Office this morning, Claire. A reporter." "Okay," Claire said again, and she meant it differently this time, and Rosario looked at her with the expression of someone who was starting to understand that the person they were talking to had been waiting for something, and this was it, and they'd been waiting quietly the whole time. Claire capped the syringe, set it on the tray, and picked up her patient's chart. "Can you cover these 2 rooms for me for 5 minutes?" she said to Rosario. "I need to make a phone call." She went to the break room. She closed the door. She took out her phone and found a contact she hadn't dialed in almost 2 years and stood in the small room with the bad coffee smell and the crooked motivational poster someone had taped to the refrigerator. "Teamwork makes the dream work," in fading blue letters, and looked at the name on the screen. Colonel Nathan Briggs, U.S. Army Medical Command. She pressed call. It rang twice. "Voss?" said the voice on the other end, and there was no surprise in it, which meant either he'd been expecting this call for a while, or he simply never wasted energy on surprise. "Sir," she said, "I'm going to need something from you." A pause. Not a long one. "How bad is it?" Claire thought about Gerald Okafor and Ryan Callum, and the 17 days of small indignities and the supplementary note in the committee file and the way Marcus Holt had looked at her in the trauma bay. Not with contempt exactly, but with something that had started as contempt and was turning into something he didn't have a word for. "Not bad," she said. "But I think it's about to get complicated." "Not bad," she said. "But I think it's about to get complicated." Briggs listened without interrupting, which was how he always listened. Not passive, but the kind of quiet that meant he was building a picture while you talked. Claire gave him the shape of it in under 4 minutes. Marcus Holt, the conduct report, the restricted scope, the Okafor letter, and the Tribune contact. She didn't editorialize. She gave him the facts in the order they happened and let him assemble it. When she finished, there was a pause that lasted about 5 seconds. "You haven't told anyone at that hospital anything about your service record," he said. Not a question. "No." "Why not?" "Because I didn't want it to be the reason they treated me a certain way. I wanted to see what they'd do when they thought I was nobody." Another pause, shorter this time. And now I know," she said. Briggs made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but in the neighborhood of one. "What do you need from me?" "Not yet. I just needed you to know where things stand. If this Tribune situation accelerates and someone starts pulling on threads, I don't want you to be blindsided." "I'm not easy to blindside, Voss." "I know. That's why I called you first." She could hear him thinking. Briggs was 61 and had been in Army Medical Command for longer than some of the residents at Hargrove had been alive. And he had the particular intelligence of someone who had spent decades in institutions and understood precisely how institutional pressure worked and where it could be redirected. "You want me to stand by," he said. "For now. And if it gets complicated?" "Then it gets complicated," she said. "And we deal with it then." "All right." A brief pause. "You're good, Voss, in case no one there is saying it." She looked at the crooked poster on the refrigerator. "Someone will eventually," she said, and ended the call. The Tribune story ran 4 days later. It wasn't front page, it was the health section, page 3, a sidebar, alongside a larger piece about hospital staffing shortages across the Intermountain West. But it had a headline that the communications office at Hargrove Memorial would have given a great deal to change. Patient credits overnight. Nurse with saving his life. Hospital subsequently restricted her role. Gerald Okafor was quoted. He spoke carefully and specifically. He named the bilateral pulmonary embolism. He described the physical symptoms Claire had observed. He said, plainly, that the nurse who entered his room on day 5 of his recovery had identified something the rest of the team had missed, and that he was alive, and that he understood the nurse had been placed under professional restrictions shortly afterward. He did not say the word retaliation. He didn't have to. Marcus Holt was listed as unavailable for comment. The hospital's external communications coordinator had issued a statement about Hargrove's commitment to collaborative patient care and multidisciplinary team environments. It was well worded in the way that said nothing. The reporter had apparently understood this because she'd included it in its entirety and then printed Gerald Okafor's letter directly below it. Claire read the article on her phone in the stairwell between the second and third floor at 6:45 in the morning before her shift started. She read it twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket and walked up the stairs and started her shift. The stairwell door was just closing behind her when she nearly walked into Douglas Firth, the hospital administrator, who was coming from the opposite direction with the expression of a man who had not slept and was blaming the newspaper for it. "Ms. Voss," he said, "I'd like to speak with you this morning. My office, 9 o'clock. "I'm on until 11, she said. "I can come at 11. He opened his mouth, closed it, nodded. She went to check on her patients. The hospital had a particular quality that morning. Not louder or quieter, but differently textured. People who caught her eye for a moment longer than usual. Conversations that paused when she walked past and resumed when she'd gone a few steps further. The article was circulating. She knew because Tobias Marsh said good morning to her for the first time in 3 weeks, and because one of the ICU nurses she didn't know well nodded at her with something that looked almost like solidarity, and because Marcus Holt, when she passed him near the elevator bank at 7:30, looked at her with an expression that had moved fully out of contempt and into something she could only describe as calculation. He was figuring out his next move. She could see it on him the way you could sometimes see a chess player thinking, not the pieces, but the quality of the attention. She didn't slow down. The 11 o'clock meeting with Douglas Firth included Pamela and a woman Claire hadn't met, introduced as Helen Marsh, the hospital's legal counsel. No relation to Tobias, presumably. Helen Marsh was in her 50s and had the practice neutrality of someone who'd spent her career knowing exactly what words to avoid. They offered Claire a settlement, not in those exact words. What Douglas Firth said was that the hospital wanted to address the situation proactively, and that there was an option to restructure her role in a way that would involve a transfer to a sister facility in Provo with enhanced responsibilities and a salary adjustment. Claire listened to all of it. The room was quiet in the way that rooms got when everyone in them was aware that a thing was being offered and was waiting to see if it would be taken. "No," she said. Douglas Firth blinked. "I want to make sure you understand that this offer, I understand it. I'm not interested in Provo." She kept her voice even. "I'm interested in doing my job here, within the full scope of my clinical training, without a conduct note in my file that misrepresents what happened." Helen Marsh leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Voss, the committee's findings are part of the formal record, and that process. The formal record shows that a physician filed a conduct complaint against a nurse the same week that nurse's assessment saved a patient's life," Claire said. "I'd think carefully about how that reads to a reporter." The room went quiet again. A different kind of quiet this time. Pamela was looking at the window. Claire stood. "I'll be on the floor if anything changes," she said, and she left. Nothing changed that day, or the next. What changed was the volume. The Tribune story got picked up by a regional health policy newsletter that went to hospital administrators across 6 states. A nurses' union representative, not anyone Claire had contacted, called the hospital's main line and asked to speak with someone about the Okafor case. 3 nurses on different floors independently mentioned the article in their end-of-shift notes, which was unusual and which meant the documentation trail had just gotten more complex for the people who wanted it simple. And then Ryan Callum's mother called. She had read the article. She'd connected the name, Hargrove Memorial, overnight nurse, clinical judgment, subsequent restriction, and she'd done the math. She called the hospital's patient advocacy line and said, very politely, that she was the mother of a 17-year-old who was currently in his junior year of high school and doing very well, thank you, who she believed would not be doing very well or anything at all if a particular overnight nurse had not identified a tension pneumothorax in a mass casualty situation and directed the appropriate intervention. She asked whether that nurse was the same nurse mentioned in the Tribune article. The patient advocacy office had taken the call at 2:15 in the afternoon. By 3, Douglas Firth's assistant had sent a meeting request to Pamela marked urgent. By 3:45, Marcus Holt had been called to a meeting that, as far as anyone could tell from the outside, he had not requested and did not want. Rosario reported all of this to Claire during a 12-minute overlap at the nursing station at the end of the afternoon shift, speaking quietly and without looking directly at her, in the manner of someone who had learned through long experience to deliver important information with the appearance of discussing something routine. The Ryan Callum mother call is a problem for them, Rosario said, updating a patient chart. 2 patients and 2 separate incidents, documented, both of them alive. I know, Claire said. Marcus is meeting with Firth right now. I know. Rosario glanced sideways. You knew that already, or you're guessing? It was the obvious next step once Ryan Callum's mother called. Firth needs to know what's in Marcus's file before anyone else starts asking. Rosario set down her pen, picked it up again. What's in Marcus's file? Claire turned a page in her chart. That's the question, isn't it? Yeah. What was in Marcus Holt's file, as it turned out, was more than a careful administrator would have wanted to explain to a reporter who was already paying attention. Claire found out on a Thursday, 11 days after the Tribune article, when Derek Faulds appeared in the break room during her lunch, in the way that he'd started appearing in places she was not following her, but not avoiding her either, which was its own kind of statement in a hospital where people were paying close attention to who was aligned with whom. He sat down. He looked like someone who had decided to do something and was now doing it and had passed through the anxiety and come out the other side. There's a prior complaint, he said, against Marcus, from 2 years ago. Claire set down her sandwich. Who filed it? A PA named Sonia Weller. She was in the surgical division for about 8 months. She flagged a medication error that Marcus made. Different situation than yours, an intraoperative dosing error. And when she flagged it, he reassigned her out of surgical and onto clinic overflow, and she left the hospital 6 weeks later. He paused. It was filed with the state medical board. It was investigated and closed as insufficient evidence, but the filing is public record. Does Marcus know you're telling me this? Marcus doesn't know I know, Derek said. Sonia was my classmate's supervising PA. She mentioned it to him when the article ran. He mentioned it to me. Claire looked at the table for a moment. The situation had just changed shape. A prior complaint meant a pattern. A pattern meant the Okafor case and the Callum case and the Weller case were no longer 3 separate incidents. They were a line. And a line was something a reporter could draw. Has anyone told the Tribune? She said. Not yet. That's why I'm here. I'm not the one who should do that, she said. No, Derek agreed. Sonia Weller is. I just didn't know if you were aware there was a Sonia Weller. Claire looked at him. He was 28 and doing something that would follow him in this field regardless of how it turned out, putting himself in the middle of something institutional and powerful because he believed it was right. And she was aware that he was young enough to not yet fully understand the cost of that, and old enough to do it anyway. You're going to tell her that someone here would like to speak with her? Claire said. I already did, he said. She said yes. Sonia Weller drove up from Provo on a Saturday morning and met Claire at a coffee shop 12 blocks from the hospital, which was far enough from Hargrove's orbit that neither of them was likely to run into someone they knew. She was 31, short, with the kind of energy that suggested she was always slightly ahead of the conversation. Not aggressive, just fast. She had a burn scar on the back of her left hand from something she didn't explain. She ordered black coffee and drank it like it was a task to complete. She described the incident with Marcus Holt in the same way Claire described things. Factually, in order, without embellishment, the intraoperative dosing error, her flag to the supervising physician, the reassignment that happened 48 hours later, the 6 weeks she'd spent on clinic overflow doing work that was 2 skill levels below what she'd been hired for. The exit interview with Pamela Reyes, in which Pamela had been kind and said almost nothing useful. "Did you consider staying and pushing harder?" Claire asked. Sonia looked at her. "I was a PA on a surgical service in a hospital where the chief of trauma had just had my access restricted. What was I staying for?" It was not a defensive answer. It was practical and accurate, and Claire understood it completely. "What made you agree to talk to Fald's contact?" Claire said. "Because you didn't leave." Sonia wrapped her hands around her mug. "I read the article. 2 incidents. The Okafor patient and then the mass casualty event. And you're still there. I don't know. I wanted to understand that." Claire drank her coffee. "I have a nephew who's learning to read," she said. "He's in Salt Lake. I want to stay near him." Sonia blinked, clearly not the answer she was expecting. "Also," Claire said, "I didn't do anything wrong. Leaving because someone wants you to leave is a different thing from leaving because it's time." Sonia was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you need from me?" "Nothing you're not willing to give," Claire said. "But if you'd be willing to speak to the same reporter who wrote the Tribune piece, I think she'd find your experience relevant." "And Marcus? He'll have counsel. He'll respond. That's his right." Claire set her cup down. "But what he did to you, and what he did to Gerald Okafor, and what he's trying to do to me, those are the same action. And the same action repeated is a pattern. And patterns belong in the record." Sonia looked out the coffee shop window at the November street, the bare trees and the gray sky, and the ordinary Saturday morning traffic of people doing ordinary things. "Okay," she said, "set up the call." The reporter's name was Vic Santana, and she had been covering the Utah health beat for 11 years, which was long enough to know when a story was a sidebar and when it was the beginning of something larger. She spoke with Sonia Weller on a Tuesday. She pulled the medical board filing and confirmed the public record. She sent a detailed list of questions to Hargrove's communications office on Wednesday afternoon, and by Thursday morning, Douglas Firth had called an emergency leadership meeting. Claire was not at that meeting. She heard about it through Rosario, who had sources in the administrative wing the way certain people always develop sources in organizations they'd been part of long enough, not through deliberate networking, but through being fundamentally trustworthy in a place where that was rarer than it should have been. It lasted 2 hours, Rosario said, during the 4-minute window they had between patient checks. Firth, Marcus, Helen Marsh, and 2 people nobody recognized. External PR, probably. What was the outcome? Unknown, but Marcus left before the meeting ended. Claire thought about that. He walked out, or he was asked to leave? The person who told me said he stepped out to take a call and didn't come back. Make of that what you will. What Claire made of it was that Marcus Holt had, for the first time since she'd arrived at Hargrove, experienced something she recognized from the field. The moment when a position you believed was defended turned out to have an exposed flank, and you didn't see it until the fire was already coming from that direction. She went back to her patients. The second Tribune story ran on a Saturday, and this time it was not page 3 of the health section. It was the front page of the local news section, with a photograph of Gerald Okafor standing in his living room in Mill Creek, looking healthy and unremarkable and entirely alive. The headline was longer this time. A pattern of retaliation? 2 patients, 2 nurses, 1 surgeon at Utah's top trauma center. Vic Santana had done it properly. The Okafor case, the Callum case, Sonia Weller's account of the prior incident, her name used with her explicit consent. The medical board filing, reproduced from public record. A comment from the nurses' union representative about systemic patterns of physician retaliation against clinical staff who flag errors. A non-comment from Marcus Holt's personal attorney, who had apparently been retained since the first article, which was itself a detail the piece noted. And near the end, 2 paragraphs about Claire Voss, described as the overnight nurse at the center of both recent incidents, who had declined to comment on the specifics of her case, but whose clinical record at Hargrove was described by multiple colleagues as exceptional and well above what the position required. That last phrase had come from someone. Claire had her suspicions. She read the article on her phone on Saturday morning in her apartment with a cup of coffee and her sister's voice in her memory saying, "Figure out what you're waiting for and wait for it better." And she thought that she had perhaps been waiting for this. Not the article exactly, but the thing the article represented, which was the moment when a private injustice became a public fact, and the people responsible for it could no longer manage it quietly. She called Briggs. He picked up on the first ring this time. "I saw it," he said. "It's going to move faster now," she said. "Yes." A pause. "The hospital's going to have to make some decisions, and when they do, there are going to be people asking who you are, Voss. The full picture." "I know." "You're ready for that?" She looked out her window at the mountains. The snow line had moved lower in the last week. Winter was coming down. "Yes," she said. "Then I'll make some calls Monday morning," Briggs said. "And Voss—" He stopped himself. Started again. "What you've been doing for the past 2 months, staying quiet, staying inside the institution, letting the record build instead of making noise. That was right. That was the right call." "It didn't feel like it every day," she said honestly. "It never does," he said. "That's how you know it's the right call." She ended the call and finished her coffee and went for a run along the shoreline trail with the wind coming down off the mountains hard and cold. And she thought about nothing much for 50 minutes, and it was the best she'd felt in weeks. Monday arrived with the quality of a day that had already decided what kind of day it was going to be before anyone woke up. Claire was on the floor by 6:30. By 7, she had taken handoff on her patients and assessed all 4 of them and updated 2 charts and identified that the patient in room 9 needed a medication timing adjustment that had been missed in the overnight documentation, and she had flagged it to the attending according to her restricted protocol, and the attending had ordered the correction, and it had taken 11 minutes total, and the patient would not know any of this had happened. At 8:15, 2 things occurred within 4 minutes of each other. The first was that Marcus Holt did not appear for his scheduled morning rounds. His patients were covered by Dr. Angie Wu, which meant someone had arranged coverage, which meant the absence was not accidental. The second was that Douglas Firth appeared on the floor, not in his office, not in a conference room, but actually on the floor, which was unusual enough that Rosario appeared at Claire's side within 30 seconds of his arrival, like she'd materialized from the wallpaper. "That's not a routine visit," Rosario said quietly. "No," Claire agreed. Firth saw her. He changed direction. He walked toward her with the expression of a man delivering information he hadn't entirely decided how to frame yet. "Ms. Voss," he said, "there are some people who would like to speak with you. If you can make yourself available at 9 o'clock. "What people?" "Representatives from the hospital board. And—" He paused. "There are also 2 individuals who arrived this morning who I believe are connected to your prior employment." He chose the word carefully. "Military." Claire's pulse did something measured. Not a spike, more like a shift into a different gear. "Which branch?" she said. Firth blinked. "Army, I believe. A Colonel Briggs and a—" "Yes," she said. "I'll be there at 9. Firth nodded and left, and Claire turned back to her patient charts, and Rosario stood very still beside her for a moment. "Prior employment," Rosario said. "Yeah." "Military." "Yeah." A pause. "How prior are we talking?" Claire pulled up the chart for room 9 and checked the medication timing update. It had been processed correctly. "Good." "Before this," she said. "Not long ago." Rosario was quiet for another moment. Then, "The way you managed the mass casualty event, the triage, the sequencing, the way you gave instructions and people just followed them, even the attendings. That was training." "Yes." "Not nursing school training." "No." Another pause, longer this time. "What did you do?" Rosario said. Not accusatory, just asking. Claire closed the chart. She looked at Rosario Gutierrez. 16 years on this floor, 2 hospital mergers, 3 different chiefs of nursing, The person who actually kept Hargrove's trauma floor functional and had been doing it without recognition for longer than most of the physicians had been practicing. "I'll tell you later," Claire said. "After 9 o'clock. She went to check on room 9. "What?" The conference room on the 4th floor was one Claire hadn't been in before. It was larger than the committee room where she'd had her review. A proper boardroom with a long table and chairs that cost more than the break room furniture combined. There were 6 people in it when she arrived at 5 minutes to 9. 3 were hospital board members she recognized from the photos in the lobby. Douglas Firth sat to the side, slightly outside the main configuration of chairs, with the posture of a man who understood that his role in this particular meeting was witness rather than participant. And across the table, standing rather than sitting, in civilian clothes but with the posture that civilian clothes never fully erased, was Colonel Nathan Briggs. He was 61 with gray at his temples and the kind of face that had spent a long time outdoors in hard conditions and was permanently marked by it. Beside him was a woman Claire didn't know. Late 40s, lean, with the identification badge of the Army Medical Command visible on her jacket. And sitting at the far end of the table, partially turned away from the door, was Marcus Holt. He had not left the building then, or he had come back. He turned when Claire entered, and their eyes met, and she saw something in his face that she hadn't seen before in all the weeks of conduct reports and restricted scopes and late-night documentation battles. She saw the moment when a person who had been certain about the nature of a situation realized they had been mistaken about the nature of the situation. Briggs straightened when she walked in. Not a formal gesture, just the small adjustment of someone whose bearing had been trained into the body over decades. "Captain Voss," he said. The room went very still. Marcus Holt's face did the thing she had described to Rosario. Not anger, not contempt, but the look of a man trying to figure out what he was actually looking at, from the beginning, starting over, with information he hadn't had before and wasn't sure what to do with now. One of the board members, a woman in her 60s named Patricia Drummond, whose name Claire had seen on the lobby donor wall, leaned forward slightly. "Captain," she said. "Former," Claire said. "I separated 14 months ago." "Army Medical Command," Briggs said, to the room rather than to Claire. He set a folder on the table. He didn't open it, just set it there with the specific deliberateness of someone who wanted its existence acknowledged before its contents were discussed. "I'd like to talk about Ms. Voss's service record, if the board is agreeable. I think it may be relevant to the conversation you're already having." Patricia Drummond looked at Douglas Firth. Douglas Firth looked at his hands. Helen Marsh, the legal counsel, was watching the folder on the table with an expression that had become very focused. And Marcus Holt was looking at Claire. Not the way he'd looked at her in the trauma bay. Not the flat dismissal of the first morning or the cold calculation of the weeks after the article. Something else entirely. Something that, on a different man in a different situation, might have looked like the beginning of understanding. Briggs reached for the folder. "Let me start," he said, "with November of 2019. "Let me start," he said, "with November of 2019. The folder Briggs opened was thin but dense, the way military documents always were, information compressed into language that said precisely what it meant and nothing decorative around it. He didn't read from it directly. He knew it well enough that the folder was more formality than reference. November 2019, he said, was when Captain Claire Voss had been deployed as senior medical officer with a specialized combat support unit operating in a classified theater. He used the word classified without apology and without elaboration, and the board members around the table absorbed it with the particular stillness of people encountering something outside their professional frame of reference. Over the course of that deployment, Briggs continued, Captain Voss had been the primary medical officer responsible for casualty management in 4 distinct high-intensity engagements. He outlined each one in broad terms, not the operational details, which remained classified, but the medical facts, number of casualties, severity of injuries, outcomes. In the 3rd engagement, a vehicle ambush that produced 11 casualties in under 4 minutes, Captain Voss had performed emergency surgical interventions under direct fire conditions with equipment that was, in his words, substantially below what any civilian emergency room would consider a minimum standard. 8 of the 11 casualties had survived. He paused there. Not for effect. It wasn't that kind of presentation. He paused because the next document in the folder required him to locate a specific page, and he did it unhurriedly. The woman beside him, Major Diane Forsyth, Army Medical Command, whose function in the room appeared to be to verify and supplement when needed, spoke for the first time. Captain Voss was recommended for the Army Commendation Medal twice and received the Bronze Star for actions during the third engagement, she said. The citation is in the file if the board wishes to review it. Patricia Drummond was very still. She had the quality of someone recalibrating, not dramatically, but at the level of fundamental assumptions. Douglas Firth was looking at the table. Helen Marsh, the legal counsel, had her pen in her hand but wasn't writing anything. And Marcus Holt sat at the end of the table with his hands folded in front of him and an expression that had finished its evolution. It had passed through every stage: dismissal, calculation, the dawning recognition of the mass casualty night, the shock of Briggs's opening address, and arrived somewhere that was quieter and more final. It was the expression of a man who understood, in full, the scale of the error he had made. Not the professional error, though that was real and was going to cost him. The human one, the one that couldn't be unfiled. Claire sat across from him and watched none of this. She was watching Briggs because Briggs was still talking and what he was saying mattered. He spoke for 22 minutes total. When he finished, he closed the folder and set it flat on the table and looked at Patricia Drummond, who appeared to be the senior board member present. "I'll answer questions if the board has them," he said. "What I won't do is tell you what your institutional response to this situation should be. That's yours to determine." A brief pause. "But I would suggest that the conduct record currently in Ms. Voss's file be considered in the context of what I've just described. And I would suggest that you consider it carefully, because the people in this room are not the only people who will be looking at it." That last sentence was the only one that had any edge to it, and it landed in the room the way a precise thing landed, without excess. Patricia Drummond turned to Marcus Holt. It was a simple turn. She didn't say anything yet. She just looked at him. Marcus Holt had been a surgeon for 16 years. He had been the chief of trauma at Hargrove for 7. He had trained residents and built a department and genuinely, actually saved lives. That part was real, and everyone in the room knew it, and it didn't change anything, but it was real. He was not a man accustomed to being looked at the way Patricia Drummond was looking at him. "I think," he said, "I'd like to speak with Helen before I respond to anything formal." "That's your right," Patricia said. Her voice was neutral in the way that neutral was itself a statement. Marcus nodded once. He stood. He buttoned his jacket in the automatic way of someone whose hands were doing something familiar while his mind was doing something harder. He walked toward the door. He stopped. He turned back, and he looked at Claire, and she looked at him. And what passed between them was not closure. It was too early for that. But it was something. Recognition, maybe. The specific kind that happened when a person who had decided what another person was met the reality of what that person actually was. He left without saying anything. The door closed. Patricia Drummond looked at Briggs, then at Claire. "Ms. Voss, I owe you an apology on behalf of this institution. Whatever the formal process determines, I want to say that directly." "Thank you," Claire said. She meant it simply and without triumph, and Patricia Drummond seemed to understand that, because she nodded once and didn't try to expand it into something ceremonial. But the formal process moved faster than Claire had expected, which meant someone, probably Helen Marsh, who understood that slow processes in documented situations created more liability than fast ones, had decided that speed was protective. Within 48 hours, the conduct note in Claire's file had been formally reviewed by the full board committee. Within 72 hours, it had been expunged. The language in the official communication was careful. The committee had determined upon review that the documentation did not accurately reflect the clinical circumstances and was inconsistent with the standard of care demonstrated by the employee in question. It did not use the word retaliation. Lawyers rarely did. Claire's restricted clinical scope was lifted. The overnight-only rotation was lifted. She was returned to full-duty status on the trauma floor, with the option to participate in the hospital's mass casualty planning committee, which had apparently existed on paper for years and met sporadically and was now, in the wake of the propane facility event and the subsequent attention, being reconstituted with actual urgency. She accepted the committee role. She did not celebrate the rest of it. Not because she wasn't relieved, she was, more than she'd let herself feel during the weeks when relief wasn't available, but because celebrating the removal of something that shouldn't have been there in the first place had always seemed like a strange way to spend energy. Rosario found her at the nursing station the afternoon the formal notification came through. "Full duty," Rosario said. "Full duty," Claire confirmed. "Mass Casualty Planning Committee." Apparently there's a lot of planning needed. Rosario considered this. "Are you okay?" Claire thought about the question. Genuinely thought about it, which was not what she usually did when people asked. "I'm tired," she said, which is different from not okay. Different but related. "Yeah." Rosario leaned on the counter. "What happens to Marcus?" "I don't know yet. Helen Marsh isn't going to let it move in public any faster than she has to." "But it moves." "It moves," Claire said. "The Weller complaint is public record. 2 patient incidents are documented. The Tribune has both stories. That doesn't go away because they fixed my file." Rosario was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's not in the building today." "I noticed." "Or yesterday." "I noticed that too." What happened to Marcus Holt happened in stages, which was how these things always happened when the institution was trying to control the narrative, and the narrative had already escaped through 2 newspaper articles and a nurses' union statement and the public record of a state medical board filing. The first stage was administrative leave, announced internally with the same careful language as everything else. The hospital was conducting a review of departmental practices. Dr. Holt would be taking a period of administrative leave during the review. Coverage was being arranged. It told the staff nothing they didn't already know, and the staff knew everything because hospitals were permeable in the way that all human institutions were permeable when the people inside them were paying attention. The second stage was the board review, which took 3 weeks and involved the committee examining 11 separate patient files from the past 4 years. Claire was not part of that process. What she learned from Derek Faulds, who learned it from the 2 external review physicians who'd been brought in to conduct the clinical analysis, and who occasionally needed coffee and conversation during the long days of chart review in the conference room on the 4th floor. The 11 files included the Okafor case, the Weller incident, and 9 additional cases where documentation suggested, in the careful language of clinical reviewers, that patient management decisions had been made in ways that were inconsistent with standard of care and where nursing or PA concerns had been documented and not acted upon. Not all 9 were Marcus's direct fault. 3 were probably coincidence or reasonable clinical disagreement, but the other 6 formed the kind of pattern that a board, staring at 11 files spread across a conference table, could not explain away. Derek reported this to Claire on a Tuesday evening in the break room, speaking in the careful, factual way he'd developed for this category of conversation. 6 cases where a non-physician raised a concern and it was suppressed, he said. And in 4 of those cases, the outcome would likely have been improved if the concern had been acted on. How improved? He met her eyes. 1 patient died, aspiration event, post-surgical. A floor nurse had flagged abnormal breathing sounds twice before the code. Both flags were documented as noted and assessed by attending. The patient coded 4 hours after the second flag. Claire sat with that for a moment. "When was this?" she said. 14 months ago, before you were here." She looked at her coffee cup. There were things about institutional failure that she had known abstractly from the outside before she came to Hargrove, knew that they happened, knew the shape of them. Knowing it abstractly and sitting in a break room hearing about a specific person who had died 14 months ago because a specific flag had been marked noted and not acted upon were different weights. "What's the board going to do?" she said. "They're recommending termination," Derek said, "and they're filing a report with the State Medical Licensing Board, which means it's not just an internal action." A report to the licensing board meant Marcus Holt's ability to practice medicine in Utah was now a matter of regulatory review. It meant that the quiet management of a problem, the administrative leave, the careful language, the internal restructuring, had moved into territory that was public and permanent. "He'll fight it," Claire said. "Probably. He has counsel. He'll argue that the review was biased by the media coverage, and the military angle, and that the clinical decisions were within the range of reasonable judgment. Derek paused. He might even be partly right about some of it. That doesn't change what the pattern shows. No, she said. It doesn't. The third stage was the one Claire hadn't anticipated in its specific form, though in retrospect she should have. It came 3 days after Derek's break room debrief, on a Friday afternoon when Helen Marsh called and asked whether Claire would be available to meet with Marcus Holt in a facilitated setting. Not a legal proceeding, not a disciplinary hearing, a conversation, with Helen present and a neutral HR representative in which Marcus had expressed a desire to address Claire directly before the board's formal determination was issued. Claire said she would think about it. She thought about it for 2 hours. She called Briggs, not for instruction, but because he was someone whose judgment she trusted enough to think alongside. You don't have to go, Briggs said. I know. What does going get you? Probably nothing I don't already have. She paused. But it might matter to him, and I'm not sure that's irrelevant. Briggs was quiet for a moment. You're not trying to let him off the hook. No. The board process is going to do what it's going to do, and I'm not in control of that, and I'm not trying to be. Then what is it? She thought about the 14 months ago patient, the aspiration event, the twice documented flag marked noted and not acted on. He needs to understand what he did, she said, not legally, not for the board, actually understand it, and I might be the only person who can make him see the specific shape of it. Briggs thought about that. That's not your job. I know it's not my job, she said. I'm choosing to do it anyway. A pause. All right, he said. Then go. Jumped. The meeting was in a small conference room on the second floor, not the boardroom. Helen Marsh was there. An HR director named James Osei, who had the careful, attentive manner of someone very good at witnessing difficult conversations without influencing them. Marcus Holt was already seated when Claire arrived. He looked like he'd been sleeping badly. Not a collapse. He was too controlled for collapse, but the specific texture of someone who had been living with something large and uncomfortable and hadn't yet found a way to set it down. He waited until Helen had confirmed the nature of the meeting, informal, not recorded, not part of the formal board record, and then he looked at Claire. I requested this because I wanted to say something to you directly, he said. Not through a process, not in a document. He paused. What I did to you was wrong. The conduct report, the restricted scope, the overnight reassignments. I knew what I was doing. I'm not going to claim I didn't. Claire looked at him. She didn't say anything yet. I've been telling myself a version of events where my concern was about clinical hierarchy and patient safety protocols, he continued, and part of me believes that. But the part of me that's been reviewing 11 patient files for 3 weeks, he stopped. Started again. You caught things, repeatedly. Things that should have been caught by the team and weren't. And instead of asking what that meant, I made it about authority. Because it was easier than asking why my floor was missing those things. The room was quiet. There's a patient, Claire said, from 14 months ago. Aspiration event. His jaw tightened. Yes. A nurse flagged her twice. Yes. Did you see those flags? A long pause. I saw one of them. I assessed her. I believed my assessment was correct. He looked at the table. I was wrong. It was not comfortable to say. She could see that it cost him something real, which was the point. Not cruelty, just accuracy. Some things needed to cost something to mean anything. Okay, she said. He looked up. I'm not in a position to give you absolution, she said, and I'm not interested in it. The board is going to do what the board is going to do. What I'm interested in is whether you understand what the actual damage was. Not to me, not to your career, to the patients. I do, he said, and then quieter. I think I've understood it for about 3 weeks, and I've been trying to find a way to not understand it. That was the most honest thing she'd ever heard him say. She nodded once. She stood. She looked at Helen Marsh, who had been entirely still throughout the meeting, and at James Osei, who had lived up to his reputation. Thank you for arranging this, she said to Helen. She left. bumped. The board's formal determination came down on a Thursday, 8 days after the facilitated meeting. Marcus Holt's employment at Hargrove Memorial was terminated effective immediately. The board cited a pattern of clinical management decisions inconsistent with the hospital's patient safety standards and a documented history of retaliatory action against clinical staff who raised patient safety concerns. The Medical Licensing Board report had been filed as required. His attorney had issued a statement indicating he would be appealing. That was his right. The process would go wherever the process went. The internal announcement was sent hospital-wide at 9 in the morning. Claire read it at the nursing station between patient checks. She read it once, completely, and then filed it with the other information in her head that needed to be present but not dwelled upon. Rosario appeared at her shoulder 3 minutes later. "Terminated?" Rosario said. "Yes." "Licensing board referral?" "Yes." Rosario looked at the screen. "How do you feel?" Claire thought about it. "Tired," she said. "Mostly tired." "Still not bad?" "Still not bad." Rosario sat down in the chair next to her. Around them, the floor continued its ordinary motion. Call lights, cartwheels, the PA system asking for someone in the ICU. It was a Thursday morning in November at a trauma hospital, and people were alive who might not have been, and people were sick who needed attention, and the work was what the work was. "There's something else," Rosario said. Her voice had changed slightly. "I heard it from the scheduling office this morning." Claire looked at her. "The trauma chief position," Rosario said. "They're forming a search committee. And apparently one of the board members, Patricia Drummond, has already put a name forward." Claire waited. "Yours," Rosario said. The words sat in the air between them. Claire Voss looked at the nursing station, the charts, the call lights. The patient board with 14 names on it, 14 people who were here and needed someone to pay attention. "I'm a nurse," she said. "You're a former Army captain with a Bronze Star and a clinical record that a licensing board is not going to forget," Rosario said. "And you just spent 2 months proving that you see this floor better than anyone who's ever run it. Trauma chief is a physician role. It's a leadership role. Hargrove revised the criteria 2 years ago. The position can be held by an advanced practice clinician with the appropriate credentials, and the board can waive remaining requirements in exceptional circumstances." Rosario paused. "I looked it up this morning." Claire said nothing. "You don't have to decide anything today," Rosario said. "But I wanted you to know before the committee meeting started, and before people started asking you in conference rooms." Claire looked at the patient board. 14 names. She thought about Danny Ruiz in Texas, studying civil engineering. She thought about Gerald Okafor standing in his living room in Mill Creek, looking healthy and unremarkable and entirely alive. She thought about Ryan Callum, 17 years old, in his junior year, breathing without a machine. She thought about the nurse who had flagged the aspiration patient twice, whose flags had been marked noted and not acted upon, who was still on this floor somewhere and still watching and still seeing things and still trying to find a way to make sure the right person heard them. She picked up the next chart. "Tell them I'll think about it," she said. But Rosario was already smiling in the particular way of someone who had asked a question they already knew the answer to, and they both understood that think about it was not the same as no, and that there was a difference, and that the difference mattered, and that on a floor where differences like that had cost real things and given real things back, the language of it was worth getting exactly right. Claire opened the chart. Room 9's patient had a blood pressure reading that morning that needed a second look. She picked up her pen and started writing. The blood pressure reading in room 9 turned out to be orthostatic hypotension. The patient had not been drinking enough fluid and had gotten up too fast that morning, and the night nurse had documented the low reading without sufficient context. Claire adjusted the care plan, added a hydration note, flagged it to the attending, and moved on. 20 minutes, no drama. This was most of what nursing actually was, as not the mass casualty events and the tension pneumothoraxes and the board meetings, but the 20-minute problems that never made the news and that kept people from becoming the kind of problem that did. She knew that. She'd always known that. It was part of why she'd come here. The think about it lasted 4 days. She spent those 4 days doing what she'd been doing since October. Her job, completely, without reservation. She covered her patients. She attended the first reconstituted meeting of the Mass Casualty Planning Committee, which was held in a conference room that smelled like new carpet and included 7 people who had varying levels of actual emergency management experience. And she listened more than she talked. And when she talked, she was specific. And by the end of the meeting, the committee chair, a hospitalist named Dr. Kwame Asante, who had been handed the role somewhat reluctantly and was clearly relieved to have someone in the room who knew what SALT triage was without having to look it up, had asked her if she'd be willing to draft the first working framework document. She said yes. On the second day, she called Briggs again, not about the trauma chief position specifically, but around it. He listened to what she didn't quite say and then said it for her. "You're wondering whether taking it changes what you came here for." "I came here to do the work," she said, "not to run the people who do the work." "Those aren't as different as you think they are," Briggs said. "You've been running things since October. You just didn't have the title." "The title changes how people see you." "Yes," he said. "That's actually the point." She thought about the nurse who had flagged the aspiration patient twice. She thought about Rosario Gutierrez, 16 years on that floor, doing the work that kept the floor functional while the person with the title took the credit and controlled who got heard. She thought about Derek Falls walking into a library with something that was going to follow him, regardless of how it ended, doing it anyway. She thought about what it meant to be the person in the room who other people could bring things to and know they would be heard. On the 4th day, she called Patricia Drummond's office and left a message saying she was available to meet. The meeting was short. Patricia Drummond was efficient in the way that people who ran significant things were efficient. She didn't use more time than a conversation needed, and she didn't perform warmth she didn't feel, but the warmth she did feel was real, and Claire appreciated both qualities. "The position as structured would require you to complete an administrative credentialing program within 18 months, Patricia said. "The board is prepared to support that financially and structurally. Your clinical role would continue in a hybrid capacity during the transition." "Who else is the committee considering?" Claire said. 2 external candidates, a trauma surgeon from Houston and a nurse practitioner from Denver with emergency management experience. Patricia paused. "I'll tell you directly that your internal candidacy is strong, but it's a real process. I'm not offering you the position today. I'm asking if you'll formally enter the search." Claire looked at Patricia Drummond across the small table. She was 63 and had been on the hospital board for 9 years, and had, in Claire's observation, done something that many people in institutional positions did not do. She had changed her mind when the evidence warranted it, and had said so plainly. "Yes," Claire said. "I'll enter the search." Patricia nodded once. "Good." She started to gather her papers. Then she stopped and looked up. "Can I ask you something that's not related to the formal process?" "Yes." "When you were in this hospital for 2 months being systematically minimized," Patricia said, "and you had a service record that would have made all of that stop, why didn't you use it?" Claire thought about the honest answer, which was also the complicated one. "Because if the only reason people treat you with professional respect is because of what they know about your background," she said, "then you don't actually know whether they respect your judgment. You just know they respect your resume." Patricia looked at her. "And you needed to know." "I needed to know what I was working with," Claire said. "What the floor was actually like, what the culture actually did when it thought nobody was watching." "And now you know." "Yes," Claire said, "now I know exactly what needs fixing and where and why." Patricia Drummond gathered her papers. "That," she said, "is a better answer than either of the external candidates gave when I asked them a version of the same question." The search process took 6 weeks, which felt both long and appropriate. Claire submitted her materials, a portfolio of clinical documentation, the mass casualty framework she'd drafted for Asante's committee, a written statement about her vision for the trauma division that she rewrote 4 times before it said what she actually meant rather than what she thought they wanted to hear. She sat for 2 formal interviews with the full search committee. She answered questions about leadership philosophy and conflict resolution and budget management, some of which she knew well and some of which she was honest about not knowing yet. The Houston surgeon withdrew his candidacy in week 4 for reasons that were described as personal. The Denver nurse practitioner was strong. Claire reviewed her public work with genuine respect and told Derek as much, because honesty about competition was something she believed in. The committee made its decision on a Friday afternoon in late January. Claire was on shift when her phone buzzed with a message from Patricia Drummond's assistant asking her to come to the fourth-floor conference room when her shift ended. She finished her shift. She checked out every patient properly. She updated every chart. She handed off to the incoming nurse, a young woman named Becca who'd been at Hargrove 4 months and was sharp and a little uncertain still, and Claire spent 6 minutes on the handoff rather than the standard 3 because the 6 minutes mattered. Then she went to the fourth floor. Patricia Drummond was there, and Douglas Firth, and 3 other board members, and Dr. Kwame Asante, and, she hadn't expected this, Rosario Gutierrez sitting slightly to the side with the expression of someone who had been invited to something and wasn't entirely sure of the protocol but was not going to miss it. "We'd like to offer you the position of Director of Trauma Services," Patricia said, "effective the 1st of March, with the transition period beginning immediately." The room was quiet in the way that rooms got when something had been decided and everyone in it knew the weight of it. Claire stood in the doorway of the conference room in her scrubs with her badge clipped to her chest and her hair still pulled back tight from the shift, and she thought about a lot of things very quickly in the way that certain moments compress time. She thought about the Tuesday morning in October when she'd walked through Hargrove's doors and Marcus Holt had looked at her like she was furniture in the wrong room. She thought about Gerald Okafor's hands, warm and alive, gripping hers in the hallway after his son learned he was going to recover. She thought about a minefield in 2019 and 8 soldiers who had made it home. She thought about her nephew, who liked dinosaurs and called on Tuesday nights and was learning to read. "Yes," she said. Rosario made a sound that was not entirely professional, and nobody commented on it, and Claire was glad. March 1st arrived cold and clear, the mountains around Salt Lake City carrying snow that wasn't going anywhere yet. The sky, the particular deep blue of high altitude in winter. Claire drove to the hospital early, earlier than she needed to, which was habit, which was probably never going away, and parked in the structure and walked through the main entrance and badged through the same doors she'd walked through every shift for the past 4 months. The trauma floor looked the same. It always looked the same. The nursing station, the patient board, the supply carts, the particular quality of fluorescent light that managed to be both too bright and insufficient. It smelled the same. It sounded the same, the layered percussion of a working hospital floor at 6 in the morning. She stopped at the nursing station. Rosario was already there, which was also not a surprise. "Director," Rosario said. "Don't," Claire said. Rosario smiled. "You're going to have to get used to it." "I'm aware. I'm working on it." She looked at the patient board. 14 names. Different names than the ones from November, but the board never stayed the same for long. It was the nature of the work. "How's the overnight handoff?" "Smooth. Becca's getting better. She caught a potassium level on the patient in 7 that the resident had glossed over." "Good catch. Make sure it's in her development notes." "Already done." Rosario paused. "There's a staff meeting at 8, department-wide, the whole trauma division." Another pause. "Your first one as director." Claire had known about the meeting. She'd called it herself, scheduled it 3 weeks ago, because there were things that needed saying to the whole floor together, rather than in pieces. And she wanted to say them before the administrative paperwork of the new role buried them in process. She spent the 2 hours before the meeting doing what she always did. Rounds, charts, the small ongoing work of paying attention to 14 people who were in this building because something had gone wrong in their bodies, and who needed someone to notice them correctly. She was in room 7 checking the potassium level patient, an 80-year-old woman named Evelyn Marsh, no relation to the legal counsel, who had been admitted for a cardiac event and who had strong opinions about the temperature of her room and the quality of the morning news program. When Evelyn looked at her with the sharp, appraising eyes of someone who had been around long enough to read people efficiently. "You're the new director," Evelyn said, "as of today." "They told me about you, the night nurse." Evelyn adjusted herself against her pillows. "She said you were the one who fixed things around here." "A lot of people fix things," Claire said. That's what someone says when they did most of the fixing, Evelyn said. I'm 81. I know the difference. Claire checked the potassium result in the chart. It had been correctly flagged. Good number. Becca had done well. How are you feeling this morning? She said. Like I'm 81 and had a heart event, Evelyn said. How do you think? Fair enough, Claire said. The result looks better today. We'll check again this afternoon. Will you check, or will someone else check? Someone else will check, but I'll see the result. Evelyn seemed to find this acceptable. Good, she said. I like knowing there's a specific person who sees the result. The department meeting was at 8 in the large training room on the second floor, which had stackable chairs that nobody ever stacked and a whiteboard that was always slightly smudged from the previous meeting's content. 41 people. Nurses, residents, PAs, respiratory techs, 2 attending physicians who covered the trauma floor rotation. The full working population of the division. Claire stood at the front of the room and looked at them. Really looked, which was different from performing the act of looking, and understood that what she was about to say mattered not because of the words, but because of whether the people in the room believed she meant them. I'm not going to give you a speech about vision, she said. I'm going to tell you 3 things, and then I'm going to ask you something. The room was quiet. The first thing is that what happened on this floor over the past several months, the cases that got documented, the patients who nearly weren't caught, none of that was unusual. It happens in institutions where clinical hierarchy is used to silence clinical observation. It happens when people learn that raising a concern costs more than staying quiet. It happened here, and people got hurt because of it, and I want to say that plainly, in a room, with everyone present, because that's what it deserves. Nobody moved. The second thing is that several people in this room did something that was hard, and did it anyway. They raised concerns, they documented what they saw, they testified to a review committee when it would have been easier not to. Some of them paid a cost for that, and some of them didn't, and all of them were right. She let that sit for a moment. I'm not going to name names because this isn't a ceremony, but I know who you are, and I want you to know that I know. She saw Derek Faulds in the 3rd row. He was looking at his hands. The tips of his ears were slightly red. She saw Becca, the young nurse who'd caught the potassium level, sitting near the back with the careful attentiveness of someone new enough to still find everything important. She saw Tobias Marsh, who had laughed in a hallway in October when Marcus Holt performed for his residents, and who had not laughed since, and who was now sitting with the specific stillness of someone carrying something they'd decided to carry differently going forward. The third thing, Claire said, is about what this floor is going to be, not what it's going to look like in a mission statement, what it's actually going to be. And that depends less on what I do than on what you do. Every shift, every patient, every time you see something and have to decide whether to say it. She paused. The question I want to ask you is this. What do you need from me, from the system, from each other to do that? Not what sounds good. What actually gets in the way? The room was quiet for a moment, and then a respiratory tech near the back, a man named Lou, who had been at Hargrove for 12 years and had the particular confidence of someone who didn't particularly care about hierarchies, raised his hand. We need to know the flags get seen, he said. Like actually seen, not marked noted. Yes, Claire said. What else? A nurse Claire didn't know well spoke from the middle of the room. When a resident overrides a nursing observation, there needs to be documentation of why, not just that it was overridden. The reasoning. Agreed. What else? It went on for 20 minutes. Real things, specific things. The kind of things that people knew because they worked the floor every day and had been accumulating the knowledge of what didn't work and not having anywhere to put it. Claire wrote none of it down during the meeting. She had the kind of memory that didn't need to, and writing would have changed the quality of the conversation, made it feel like minutes rather than what it was. People speaking into a room where someone was actually listening. After the meeting ended and people were filing out, Dr. Kwame Asante fell into step beside her in the hallway. That was different, he said. Different from what? From how those meetings usually go. He considered. Usually someone talks at the room for 30 minutes about strategic priorities, and everyone leaves feeling like they attended something. Did they feel like they attended something today? No. he said. They felt like they were in it. He glanced at her sideways. Which is going to make your job harder, you realize. People who feel like they're in something start expecting to be in something. Good, she said. That's the point. The licensing board process regarding Marcus Holt moved at the speed that regulatory processes moved, which was not fast but was consistent. Claire was not a party to the proceedings. She received one formal notification from the State Medical Licensing Board that her documented clinical observations had been included in the evidentiary record, and that was the extent of her formal involvement. What she learned from Vic Santana, who had continued covering the story and who called Claire twice over the following months. Not to ask her to comment on Marcus specifically, she declined those questions consistently, but to verify facts of public record before publishing them. The licensing board's investigation ran 4 months. It included the 11-case chart review, the Weller complaint, testimony from 3 current and former Hargrove staff members who had agreed to speak on record, and a review of Marcus Holt's clinical documentation practices across a 6-year period. Claire didn't read the full investigation report when it became public. She read the summary and the findings and left the rest for the people whose job it was to act on it. The board's determination was issued on a Tuesday in June. Marcus Holt's Utah medical license was suspended for a period of 18 months, with reinstatement conditional on completion of a supervised practice program and a formal remediation course in clinical team communication and patient safety culture. He was not permanently barred from medicine. The board's language was careful about proportionality, and his legal team had been thorough. But suspension was not the outcome he or his counsel had been arguing for, and the conditions for reinstatement were substantial, and the public record of the determination would follow his license wherever he went. Vic Santana published the story the same day. It was thorough and accurate. The headline was plain: Utah surgeon's license suspended following patient safety investigation at Salt Lake Trauma Center. Claire read it at her desk on the 4th floor. She had an office now, which still felt slightly unreal, on her lunch break, which she mostly spent working, which was also probably never going to change. She read it completely. She thought about the aspiration patient from 14 months ago. She thought about Sonia Weller driving up from Provo on a Saturday morning with a burn scar on her hand and black coffee and the willingness to say plainly what had happened to her. She thought about the fact that a license suspension and a remediation program were not the same thing as the year that Sonia Weller had lost, or the patient who had not survived, or the people whose flags had been marked noted and filed. She thought about the difference between justice and satisfaction, and how they were related but not identical, and how the honest thing was to hold both without pretending the gap between them wasn't there. She closed the article. She picked up the mass casualty framework revision she'd been working through before lunch. There was a section on interdepartment communication protocols that wasn't right yet and needed another pass. She started on it. Her nephew called on a Tuesday night in February, which was a few weeks before the director role started and in the middle of everything, and she'd almost let it go to voicemail because she was tired in the way that made even small tasks feel large. She answered it anyway. He was 7, and his name was Marco, and he had recently decided that his favorite dinosaur was the Pachycephalosaurus because, as he explained at some length, it had a dome-shaped skull that was 25 centimeters thick, and it used its head as a weapon, which he found satisfying. She lay on her couch in her apartment and listened to him explain the Pachycephalosaurus for 11 minutes, and she asked questions, and he answered them with the total seriousness of someone who had done his research and wanted it acknowledged. And by the end of the call, she was laughing in a way she hadn't in longer than she could precisely remember. "Are you coming at Christmas?" he asked near the end. "I'm local now, buddy. I can come whenever." A pause while he processed this. "Can you come Saturday? We're building something." "What are you building?" "I don't know yet. Dad says we'll figure it out when we start." "Okay," she said. "Saturday." After the call, she lay there for a while in the quiet apartment with the city outside the window doing what cities did at 10 at night. She thought about what her sister had said. Figure out what you're waiting for, and wait for it better. And she thought that the waiting was over, or at least that this particular waiting was over and a different kind was beginning, which was how it always went if you were paying attention. She was paying attention. She'd always paid attention. It had cost her things and given her things back, and the balance was still being calculated, which meant she was still in it, which was the point. In April, Hargrove Memorial formally announced the new Trauma Safety and Communication Policy, a document that had come out of the Mass Casualty Planning Committee, but which was substantially built on the framework Claire had been developing since November. It included a mandatory peer review process for overridden clinical observations, a transparent escalation protocol with documented reasoning requirements, and a quarterly reporting structure that made patient safety concerns visible to the board rather than absorbed into departmental management. It was not perfect. Nothing created by committee was perfect. There were sections that had been softened in the negotiation process, and sections that were going to need revision after the first year of implementation showed what actually worked versus what looked good on paper. Claire knew this. She'd been in enough institutional processes to understand that the first version was a beginning, not a destination. But it was real. It was in the official policy document, ratified by the board, distributed to every department. The nurse who saw something and flagged it now had a pathway that didn't depend on the goodwill of whoever happened to be holding authority that day. That was the thing that mattered. Not the document, the pathway. The fact that the next Becca who caught a potassium level, the next Claire who walked into a room on day 5 and noticed a breathing pattern, the next Sonia who identified a dosing discrepancy, they would have somewhere to go with it that wasn't a sealed door. At the policy ratification meeting, Patricia Drummond made a brief remark about the significance of the document. She was measured about it, as she was measured about most things, but at the end she said something that wasn't in her prepared remarks. "This hospital made some expensive mistakes," she said, looking around the room. "Some of them cost us money and reputation, and those we can repair. Some of them cost patients, and those we cannot." She paused. "What we can do is make sure the conditions that allowed those mistakes are no longer present. That's what this policy is. Not a solution, a condition. The solution is you, every day, doing the work." It was the right thing to say, and Claire noted it. Afterward, in the hallway, Rosario fell into step beside her, still on the trauma floor, still doing what she'd been doing for 16 years, but now with a formal designation as senior clinical lead that came with protected documentation time and a seat at the weekly safety review, which Claire had created specifically because of who Rosario was and what she knew. "Good meeting," Rosario said. "Parts of it." "The Patricia part." "Yes," Claire said. "The Patricia part was good." They walked down the corridor together, and the hospital moved around them the way it always moved. People and carts and the sound of something being announced on the PA and the specific relentlessness of a place that didn't stop because of the hour or the season or the things that were happening in the conference rooms on the upper floors. "I've been here 16 years, Rosario said after a moment. "I know. In 16 years, I have never had a formal seat at a safety review." "I know," Claire said. Rosario was quiet for a few steps. "Thank you." Claire looked at her. "You were doing the work the whole time. I just made the structure match the reality." "That's not a small thing," Rosario said. "No," Claire agreed. "It's not." There was a moment, sometime in May, that Claire would come back to later when she thought about this chapter of her life and tried to locate the thing that had mattered most. It wasn't the director offer or the board meeting where Briggs had opened a folder and read a room, or the morning the Tribune ran its second story. It wasn't even the conversation with Marcus Holt in the small conference room on the second floor, though that one stayed with her in a different way. It was a Wednesday afternoon in the step-down unit, end of a long shift, when she was doing a final check on her way out, and she passed the room of a patient she hadn't been primarily responsible for, a man in his 60s, recovering from a bowel resection, whose nurse was a third-year travel nurse named Adriana, who was careful and competent and not quite confident yet. Adriana was outside the room with a chart and a look on her face that Claire recognized. "What are you seeing?" Claire said. Adriana looked up. "His oxygen sats have been trending down, just slightly, but the pattern over the last 2 hours." "Have you flagged it?" "I was about to. I wanted to make sure I wasn't—" She stopped. I didn't want to bother the attending over something that might be nothing. Claire looked at her. If you're seeing a pattern, you're not bothering anyone. That's the job. I know, the SAT number alone might be nothing, Claire said. The pattern is the information. Trust the pattern. Adriana nodded. She straightened. She went to the attending. The attending came. The SAT drop turned out to be early atelectasis, a common post-surgical complication, easily addressed, not dangerous when caught, potentially serious if not. The patient got breathing exercises and an incentive spirometer and was fine. Adriana found Claire at the elevator as she was leaving. You were right, she said, about trusting the pattern. You already knew that, Claire said. You'd already seen it. You just needed someone to confirm that it was worth saying. Adriana looked at her for a moment. How did you get to a point where you just say it without second-guessing? Claire thought about the honest answer. I second-guessed constantly, she said. Still do. The difference is I stopped letting the second-guessing be louder than what I was actually seeing. It wasn't inspirational, as advice went. It wasn't the kind of thing you put on a poster. But Adriana nodded in the way that meant she'd actually heard it, and the elevator came, and Claire got in. On the ride down, she thought about what she would tell someone who asked what the past 7 months had been. Not a story about a nurse who turned out to be a soldier, not a story about an arrogant surgeon who got what was coming to him. Those things were true, but they weren't the point. The point was simpler and harder than that. The point was what happened in institutions when people decided that hierarchy was more important than accuracy. What it cost, specifically, in units of human consequence, and what it took to change that. Not a dramatic arrival, not a revelation, not a single moment where the right person said the right thing and everything corrected. What it took was someone who stayed, who kept seeing what she saw and saying what she said and doing it again the next day, even when the doing of it cost something, because the alternative was a floor where a nurse flagged abnormal breathing sounds twice and had the flag marked noted and the patient coded 4 hours later, and that was not a floor worth keeping quiet to preserve. That was the thing. Not the Bronze Star, not the folder, not the director's office on the 4th floor. The staying. The daily, unspectacular, expensive act of staying and seeing and speaking until the structure around you either broke you or bent. The structure had bent. She walked out through the main entrance into the cold May evening, the mountains still holding snow on their upper peaks, the city doing its ordinary thing around her. She got in her car. She texted her sister, "Saturday still good?" The reply came before she'd started the engine. "Marco has been asking about you every day." Yes, Saturday. She put the car in drive and headed home through the early dark, and somewhere behind her the hospital's lights were on in all its windows, and inside it 41 people were doing a shift, checking charts, noticing things, deciding whether to say them. And now, because of a sequence of events that had started with a laugh in a hallway in October, they had a reason to believe that saying them was worth the breath. That was enough. It wasn't everything. It was never everything. But it was enough. And enough was what you worked for, and enough, if you held it clearly and didn't romanticize it into something it wasn't, was how the real things got built. Claire Voss drove home. Tomorrow she had rounds at 6.